Hello and welcome to episode 88 of Communicast, the podcast dedicated to enhancing communication skills. I'm your host, Scott D'Amico, president of Communispond. Today I'm joined by Bryan Baldwin, a dynamic professional with a fascinating career journey that spans the music industry, corporate leadership, and learning and development. From DJing and music production to leading sales teams and shaping educational programs, Bryan has honed the power of communication, storytelling, and relationship building across vastly different industries. In this episode, we explore what makes a great communicator, the power of networking, and the importance of embracing feedback, even when it's tough to hear. Plus, Bryan shares some invaluable lessons from his music career that apply to the business world in surprising ways. Let's dive in. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me today. Looking forward to our conversation.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Scott. Glad to be here.
My pleasure. So to kick it off, before we dive too deep into our conversation, why don't you tell the listeners just a little bit about you and your career journey? Because you have quite an interesting story with where your career has gone.
Yeah, no, I started off my professional career actually in the music industry. I was working in the medical field kind of part-time as I was building my craft in that industry and did it professionally for about 10 years. But partway through that journey, I realized that I shouldn't have dropped out of college a couple of times because my business acumen skills were quite challenged dealing with a lot of the organizations that I was working with in the business. And so what I was able to do is take business classes at night, and what I was learning in my classes, I was able to take back and directly import it into what I was working on during the daytime. And throughout my music journey, that became such a useful thing to me. When I achieved some pretty lofty goals in that business, I wanted to go back and work in education and learning and development to really help folks achieve their goals, kind of my way of giving back. And so that started my second corporate career, which was really around sales leadership, consultative services, really focused around education technology, and skill development for human capital practice.
I love it. Yeah, that's such a kind of a fascinating circle there where you in the music business, you realize you have some sort of a skills gap there. So you go back to school, earn your degree, and actually multiple degrees, Dr. Baldwin. So multiple degrees, and realize, wow, this has had such a big impact on my life and my career. I now want to kind of give back a little bit and ultimately serve in this industry to help others realize the power of education and training for their career growth. So that's I love hearing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting too, Scott, is through that journey, I was able to obviously make a lot of acquaintances and colleagues like yourself and others. And I always kept in touch with the relationships from the music business. And when I went through some personal changes over the last couple of years, music started coming back into my life, and I've actually started a small music business yet again in my spare time.
Fantastic. And I think something we'll talk a little bit about later, I'm sure, is the power of your networking and making connections and just really the power of having a strong network and how can, like you said, kind of keep coming back throughout your life. So I am sure throughout your career, working in education and training, being in the music industry, running your own organizations, you've come across some folks that are fantastic communicators. Likely, we talk about this a lot, some not so good communicators, and you can still learn from them as well, right? But if you think about some of those great communicators you've interacted with, there's likely some common themes. So when you hear that term, that somebody's a great communicator or they have strong communication skills, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think a couple of things, but if I could distill it down into this, I would say that it's someone who can really break down a vision and a mission, whether it's for a team, an organization, to its simplest parts and convey why they are important. and then really connect the aspirations, the emotions of the team or the folks that they're leading into action, and really empowering them to share the story and sentiment in their own words. But they are able to communicate that mission and vision where every member of the team not only knows how they impact that vision and the mission, but then they're able to go out and speak to it and become those brand ambassadors for your organization. So I think someone who's very strong at communicating those things to their teams have, for me personally, resonated in my career.
Yeah, and I know you and I go way back. We've followed very similar career paths for a number of years and have worked for several great leaders and great communicators where, as you mentioned, they are very strong at painting the picture, the vision, and helping you to understand how do you fit in to this bigger picture. And I think most importantly, empowering you to get after it, right? So you kind of get those three levels there. What's the big picture? How do I fit into this? And then also getting me energized and excited and realize I have the freedom, the leeway to, as you mentioned, kind of make these things my own, put this into my own words, internalize it, and then in turn get other people excited about it.
Absolutely, Scott.
So as you think about that, right? These people that paint the big picture, right? They get people excited. For me, one of the things that's always jumped out is using stories to do that. So as you think about communication, I know as you and I talk quite frequently, you use a lot of stories and analogies. How do you see that playing into the overall kind of grand scheme of things of being a great communicator?
The folks that can tell the stories really, really well, I think, connect with the audience, but I also think they know their audience really, really well. They take the time to really distill down what's important to that audience, what's going to motivate them. They do their research ahead of time, and they really find out how to read the room before they get in it, and they come in really, really prepared to deliver that message. They also, again, back to that why, they instill the why the message is important with those folks that they're delivering the message to, and then showing a clear line of action that can come out of the back end of that communication.
The thing you mentioned there that really jumps out to me is knowing your audience, understanding what motivates them, what drives them, but also just at a macro level, starting to understand the audience. And I forget where it was, but recently I saw a video where somebody was talking about a reference that they were making in a presentation, kind of as part of a story. And just because of the audience, I think it was like the age of the audience, they had no idea of this reference. The reference was 40, 50 years old, that they're referencing some sort of TV show or character. And so it was really much falling flat on the audience. In the same vein, a comedian was just talking about that, where they had this joke that worked for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, when they're telling that joke, it starts falling flat. And it wasn't because it was offensive or anything like that. It was just purely the audience just didn't get the reference. The reference was too old that it was no longer relevant. So as you think about your audience, there's so many factors and so many layers that you have to take into consideration as you are crafting your narrative, building in stories, and then focusing ultimately on what's going to be most important for them. Bryan, as you think about the workplace today, and it's changed obviously over time, and I would say especially over the past 5 years, we've seen a lot of changes in the workplace with work from home and remote work and hybrid work and just different expectations of people. What are you seeing as some of the key skills that are mission critical for people to have today to be successful in their careers?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few, Scott, and I'll give you a list, but there's a few I'd definitely focus in on. One is clear and concise messaging. You have to have strong presentation skills, especially in the virtual environment. It's a lot different. Had an opportunity to work with Communispond on some of those virtual presentation skills, and each one of those interactions I've been able to pick up some different nuggets to take back and implement in my daily activities. Emotional intelligence, huge right now. Conflict resolution, huge right now. But I think some of the most important ones are collaboration, networking, in the entertainment business, nonverbal communication, and the very same for more of your traditional corporate type roles. And then something I like to call notice the nerves. I think noticing the nerves, in other words, that feeling in your gut, that anticipation, the excitement before you deliver your message. If there's not that anticipation or that excitement, or at least a little bit of nervousness, there's probably a problem.
Mhm.
You're a little too overconfident. And, whether that's you're a performer going out on stage or you're an executive delivering to a crowd of your executive leadership team or to your frontline sales organization, if that's not there, there's probably a problem.
Yeah, I think we've all probably at some point in our careers been there where maybe we were just phoning it in a little bit, right? As you mentioned, you get up to whether you're delivering a pitch to a client, doing a leadership team presentation, or you're a performer stepping out there on stage. If you're not feeling something before you go out there, some sort of level of nerves or anxiousness or excitement, likely it might be you just don't care anymore, right? You're like, I'm done with this. I'm done with this project. I'm sick of talking about this initiative. I'm tired of playing this same song over and over and over again, right? You really do need to be aware as you're going out there. Think through, for the folks listening to this, think through the last several big meetings that you've had. Once again, whether it's pitching to a client or talking to your team or talking up the food chain, so to speak, to senior leaders. Did you have some sort of level of nervousness or excitement or anxiety about it? If you didn't, you may really start to think, okay, why is that? And could be, as I just mentioned, maybe you're tired of it, you're done with it, you're burnt out. It could be that maybe you don't agree with what you're doing, right? I don't agree with this direction the business is going in, but I have to kind of keep doing this. It's part of my job. It could be any number of things. So it's really important to have that level of awareness of, okay, I'm not feeling anything when I'm going into these big high stakes meetings. And I think the other thing that it could be is that you're so focused on your message, your slides, what you want to achieve, how you want to put the song out there or your set list that, like you talked about, Bryan, you've lost track of the audience and what's most important for them. So, like I said, if you're not feeling that stuff, it's important. Do a little bit of reflection, see what might be causing that.
Yeah, and something that goes along with that too, Scotty, and you talk about being really prepared. It's also having people in that audience, whether it's a performance or a meeting, that you've prepared ahead of time as well to cue you in case you're not paying attention to some of those cues you're getting from the audience because maybe they're sick of the message. So I think having those helpful allies is a pretty neat tool to put in your bag as well.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that. Like it's come up a couple of times sporadically in the different episodes, but yeah, having those allies out there when you are doing some sort of presentation or performance. Talk a little bit more about that. I think it's an interesting concept.
I'll give you an example from the entertainment business because it's fresh. I'm working with a group called Day Drinkers. Shameless plug, DAYDRNKZ. So my wife has been around for the rehearsals. So she sees us rehearse. She kind of knows the tempo of the show, etc. And so when we go out to perform live, I have her strategically placed in the front of the crowd so that she can kind of gauge, if they need a little bit of a longer break in between songs. If the last song we did really hit, or if something's off, she can kind of cue me on stage and I can cue the rest of the group so we can make adjustments in real time depending on what's going on with the crowd. So that's just one example.
That's a great example. And I think it's applicable to even into the workplace. If you do have a big presentation coming up, maybe you've been working with a partner on it, right? You've practiced it with them. They've seen it. They know what the core message is. They know what the desired outcomes are. If they're in that audience while you're presenting, you can kind of look to them, one, as a friendly face, like to help bring the nerves down, right? You see a smiling, friendly face, somebody that's nodding in agreement with you, that can help with the nerves. But perhaps maybe you're a little flat. They might have a signal like, come on, amp it up a little bit. Let's get a bit more energy going. Or once again, you have these cues already, kind of like a baseball coach, where it's like stealing seconds. Like, okay, you need to cut this short and move on. You're losing the audience. And I think that's where preparation also comes into play, because when you are prepared, and not prepared to the point of memorization, but prepared to the point that you can be flexible, is ultimately what you want to go for. So that I know the content well enough that I can pivot, cut this section short, I can skip over a couple of things, whatever, based on what I'm seeing from, maybe it's my plant and the audience, or that I'm just in general seeing from the audience members, where they're leaning into this, like they're into this. So I'm going to park here for a little bit longer and realize there's some other stuff that I can glance over and they can get it in the follow up or the recap. Or I realize I'm losing them here. I need to shift course. I need to get through this, get on to the next thing that's going to be most important to the audience.
Absolutely.
Bryan, as you think about your career journey and the success that you've had, both in the corporate space, the learning and development space, as well as within the music industry, what would you say would be the 1 to 2 key communication skills that have really led to your success?
Yeah, I would say the two that have been absolutely critical to me is networking and collaboration, and building relationships through networking. I think relationships are absolutely everything in business, in life, period. I also think it's important to take the personal out. And whether it's through the collaboration and networking, you got to take the personal out. And two examples of that, Scott, that helped me in my music career early on. The first story helped me learn the lesson. So I was doing a show in Minneapolis, Minnesota in February, and I was a DJ performing a rave party back when rave parties were a big deal, electronic music. So I was doing a show in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I was an opening DJ for a headline act. So I did my set, watched his set. It was fantastic. And when he got off stage, I went to say hello, and he asked me a very interesting question. He said, "Don't you think it's kind of lame that you're getting paid to play other people's music?" And I took personal offense to that, because I was doing well. I was going up and down the East Coast, DJing nightclubs and parties, and was making some pretty good money at it. And so I just kind of dismissed the guy and went about my business. Well, I was doing another show in Atlanta a couple months later, and I ran into this same guy, and guess who's opening for him? Me. He's the headliner, I'm opening. So he's doing something right. So I started thinking to myself, man, that was a question that agitated me, but maybe I should go talk to this guy again. And so I approached it a little differently this time. And I said, "Hey, I've been thinking about what you asked me. You asked, don't you think it's lame that you get paid to play other people's music?" And I told him that, yeah, maybe it is. And that totally changed him and his approach to me. He said, now you're ready to learn something new. And so we started talking. By the end of the evening, we exchanged numbers. Long story short, I wind up in this guy's recording studio, because all those vinyl records he was playing at the nightclub that had no label on them were records that he made. So he taught me how to produce electronic music, taught me how to connect all the synthesizers and drum machines and computers and all of the things, make them talk and make music. And we started doing live techno shows after that, making 2 times as much as we were DJing. So completely changed the trajectory of my career in the music business for that section of time. And so, taking the personal out led to exponential growth. Another example of taking the personal out is later on in my career, I had started moving into various genres of music, and I had a pretty famous musician come over to my recording studio, and he wanted to hear my production. So I played him some of my techno production that I had been making years previous. And he was listening to it in the recording studio, and he says, "You know what? I hear what you're trying to do, but it sounds terrible." There's the personal touch again, right? Sounds terrible. Oh my gosh, I'm emotional. This is my pride and joy, my music. And this guy saying it sounds terrible. But instead of doing what I did with the first gentleman in Minneapolis and dismissing him, I stayed quiet and let him further explain it's not mixed right, which means it wasn't mixed in the stereo field. It didn't sound like a good record sonically. Not that the production was bad, just sonically it needed to change. And so I spent the next 2 years of my life working with this gentleman, learning how to mix sound and make sure that when a record comes out, it sounds like it's ready to go on the radio. And so that made me a better writer, producer, and also opened up a new revenue stream for my business because now I could engineer records and record records and edit and mix and start getting records ready for the mastering process, all through taking the personal out, collaborating with my new friend, and him introducing me to his network of other musicians and producers and record companies that I did not have entree into at that time. So that really brought me more into the professional world of the music industry.
Those are great examples, right? And this idea of taking the personal out, really, try not to take things so personally, right? Doesn't mean not to have personal connections and understand people as a person, their personal lives, but yeah, really try to avoid the knee-jerk reaction of taking things personally and shutting down when you receive feedback, something critical, and regardless of how it's delivered, trying to think, okay, is this person coming with good intent? That's the key to a lot of this is people miss out on the intent, and intent is oftentimes lost in communication, more so in written communication than in verbal communication. But if I think back to that first example when the person says, don't you think it's lame that blah, 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 very much a leading question, right? So if they were to reframe that and just say, what are your thoughts about getting paid to play other people's music? Likely you would have been more receptive to that and had a conversation initially, right? Versus dismissing them. So I think it is on both sides for people to, one, try not to get offended and take things personally when you get something that might come across as harsh. Is there good intent behind it? And then when you're the sender of the communication, realizing that the way that you frame your questions and your feedback can cause people just to dismiss you because of how it's delivered. That's just how people are wired. So I think there's kind of both sides of the coin there to think about.
Yeah, and I like that you bring up the good intent piece, Scott, and that's important to remember because these guys, in my case, saw something, right? They wanted to help. They might not have known how to plug in to help, but they saw something that either they wanted to give back, in my example of going to work for the organization that helped me, or whether it was something else that they saw in me that I didn't see in me. And so that oftentimes, we have people around us that love us, that know us, that want to help us. They see things in us that maybe we don't see ourselves. And knowing that we have people around us with that good intention, I think looking at it that way is a really great way to look at it, Scott.
And it's actually a nice segue to what I wanted to talk about next. Around, like I said, you mentioned you have these folks that see something in you, they want to help, they want to give back, they want to try to invest in you. Whether they took the right approach to do it is debatable, but ultimately it worked out. But Bryan, if you think of someone throughout your career who's had an influence on your communication style, right? Maybe something that you've observed from them, you're like, oh, that's really working. You take it, you tweak it, you make it your own, put it in your toolbox, so to speak. Who's been someone that's really influenced your style?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of great mentors. Been very blessed in that department, but one that really stands out to me is a dear friend who started off as a colleague, became a boss, became a business partner, and is still a dear friend today, and that's Frank Wilkerson. And what a great communicator. And I think the things that resonate the most with me from him is he's very genuine and he's got a great head and a great heart. And he uses the three together unbelievably well.
I know Frank very well. Think of him in extremely high regard, as I imagine there are hundreds and thousands of people that he's touched throughout his life and career that feel the same way about him. And the other thing that really jumped out to me when working with Frank was his use of stories and analogies. Just from the umbrella metaphor to the hitching up the trailer. He had a great way of taking these complex concepts that sometimes the teams weren't grasping or sometimes our clients weren't grasping, and using some sort of story or imagery to help really accelerate people and get to that adoption and understanding of what we were trying to do.
Yeah, and I think too it was his genuine concern and care for his people and for
Mm-hmm.
his organization. I recall going on several site visits with him. We were in an organization that was going through some pretty significant changes, external pressures, internal pressures, you name it, they were there. And Frank took the time, and I'll never forget this. We were on a flight to a market, and we were meeting with 44 sales representatives and their leadership team to really kind of walk through what those changes meant. There was going to be impacts to the team. So it's a high pressure situation, high emotional situation. And Frank had me create a briefing book while we were on the way to this meeting. And he sat there and studied it the entire trip. And when we got there, you can imagine the scene. There's 44 representatives there, plus their leadership team. They know they're there for a not good message, right? Frank's their new leader. They haven't met him in person before. He went around that room and he said, "Hey, we've got some difficult things to deal with here, folks, but I'm with you and I know you and I know what you've done and I know what I can help you do." And he literally went around that entire room and named every single person in that room because he took the time to get to know them before he got there. He knew their business before he got there. So when he was able to sit down and have those coaching conversations with their leadership, he was informed. And he had the facts. The facts are the friends, part of the head. But he also knew that this was going to affect people's lives, their family, their personal financial situations, etc. And he took that into account and tried to make it as comfortable as possible while delivering some not so comfortable messages to folks, but at least giving them a path to know where things were going to end up.
Words are easy, actions are a lot harder. And when you're able to back up those words with actions, that's for me true leadership in the way that you build culture. And I've heard that story a number of times before, right? Where he really understood who the people were, what the work they were doing, where he could assist, maybe where he couldn't, understand the gaps, and then start to come with a plan forward. Absolutely. Bryan, as we are wrapping up here, what piece of closing advice would you have for folks listening to this, really in general, just around the importance of the skills that we talked about today?
Yeah, I think with the communication skills, and this is something that I try and work on all the time as well, Scott. And sometimes I'll call you and bounce some ideas off of you. I have a great group of my personal board of directors, I like to call them, of former colleagues, friends, whatnot that I've met over the years, whose opinions that I really respect, that I like to bounce the ideas and practice with. I also like to practice with people that have absolutely no clue what I'm talking about, because I figure if I can practice with them and their understanding and responding and asking great questions back to me, then the audience who knows what I'm talking about, it's probably going to resonate with them a little bit more. So I think those would be some tips and tricks that I would impart. Again, taking the personal out of it. I can't reiterate that enough, as well as next time you're getting ready to present, whether it's a sales pitch, whether it's a performance on stage, if you don't have that nerve, if you don't notice the nerve, check yourself.
Wholeheartedly agree. And I really like that idea of practicing with somebody who has no idea what you're talking about. Because if you're simply practicing with your colleagues, your peers at work, people on your team that are very familiar with it, right? The day in and day out, they know it, they've heard it 1,000 times. the message is going to make sense to them. So for example, if you have kids at home, right, maybe you have teenagers and you have a big presentation coming up, present to them. If they can follow it, you're golden, right? If you lose them, there's a good chance you might lose the audience that, once again, doesn't really necessarily know what you're talking about. It's a new initiative. It's a new project at work, new product, introductory discovery call with a sales client, whatever it is. If you can bring that message down and make it very simple so that your kids could understand it, or maybe people that don't work in your space can understand it, I think that's really going to help the message land when you really get in front of the key audiences. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me. Really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You as well, Scott. Thanks for having me, and hopefully some of these will help your audience.
I'm sure they will. Special thanks again to my guest, Bryan Baldwin, for sharing his journey and insights on communication, leadership, and the power of networking. Whether you're in business, entertainment, or any other industry, these skills can help you build stronger relationships and make a lasting impact. As we close this episode, remember that mastering communication is a continuous journey. Make sure to stay connected with Communicast by subscribing so you can benefit from conversations with future guests. If you found value in today's episode, I'd be grateful for your support. Leaving a rating or review is a fantastic way to let us know the impact this show has had on you. Thanks, and have a great day.